Thanks to Card Market for sponsoring this video. Hi, I'm March from StrataGames, and today we're talking about something that I think has been on every Pauper player's mind in the last month or even 6 months or so, and that is Cast Down dead? Cast Down has been the primary and best black removal spell, or really removal spell at all, in the entire format since its downshift in Double Masters on August 7th, 2020. The reason for this is it destroys any non-legendary creature, and the format doesn't feature that many legendary creatures. Before Cast Down was downshifted, the primary removal spells that were played was Victim of Night in a mono-black control deck like Gardens or mono-black Devotion, but double black pips are hard to play in any deck that's not mono-black, so Doomblade, the original removal spell and where Dies to Doomblade comes from, was the removal spell people used, but of course black creatures are pretty prevalent in the format. So August 2020 changed the landscape of removal spells, taking these 2-mana conditional removal spells and giving us essentially an unconditional removal spell. Cast Down might as well just have had the text of murder, destroy target creature. That's because the only legendary creatures that were legal in Pauper when this was printed were these. We had Joven and Chandler. These are actually the only 2 cards that are printed at common in a physical set, but as you can tell from their mana costs and their abilities, they're not very playable cards. They do have kind of powerful, repeatable abilities, but just really expensive and slow for what they do. Then there was a 10-card cycle of Legends from Legends that were originally uncommon in their paper version, but were downshifted to common on MTGO in the Masters Edition 3 set, which primarily brought cards from the Dark, Legends, and Portal. Ramirez de Pietro is, believe it or not, the most playable of those 10 cards, as it's the only one with a keyword, or rather any ability at all. Every single other legend from that cycle is vanilla, and this one, having First Strike, even being very overcosted at 6 mana and 2 colors for a 4/3, is the best of the bunch. It should be pretty obvious then that the 12 legendary creatures that are playable in Pauper at the time of Cast Down's downshift were unplayable and thus not a relevant factor for Cast Down. Then 15 years after the Masters Edition of 3 came out, 30 years after these cards came out in paper, we finally got another legendary creature at common in Modern Horizons 3. That was Skoa Embermage, and of course this sparked quite a bit of conversation around it being legendary, and the Grandeur ability, which should only be used on a cycle of cards originally. People tried to make Skoa work a little bit in Pauper. The problem is it's very expensive for what it does, so the answer to expensive cards is often playing Tron. That's what people tried to do, was a mono-red Tron deck with this. Unfortunately, to actually use its Grandeur ability, you also have to sacrifice mountains, so now you're balancing both mountains and Tron lands, and your payoff for that is just a Fire Blast on a stick. Skoa was very quickly forgotten as not a playable card, and thus not a problem for the discussion of Cast Down. But fast forwarding another 15 months to September 2025, and we got Spider-Man. This was the first time we had more than one legendary creature printed at common in a set, again in about 15 or 30 years. And this was the beginning of a new era, getting not just 1, but 10 new legendary creatures printed at common. Now, out of those 10, only 3 of them are playable enough that I ever saw them played in leagues. I'm sure some people played with some of the other ones, but these are the only 3 that I ever saw cast. Swarm showed up a little bit in Rakdos Madness as the 5th or 6th copy of Kitchen Imp, but quickly people found that not having haste made it not good enough. And Spider-Man Brooklyn Visionary, I saw a little bit in Elves or Gruul Monsters as a creature that could attack pretty well, ramped a little bit, and legitimately dodging Cast Down was a relevant factor. However, that quickly also became a card not worth playing, and the only card that I saw persist from Spider-Man, still being played a month or 2 after the set released, was this middle Spider-Man Webslinger, which has been seen heavily played in White Weenie. It mostly showed up as a 2-of in one specific deck, White Weenie, and as a 3/3 vanilla. Every once in a while, you'll find yourself with a Cast Down wanting to kill this, and be a little upset by the fact that you can't do that, but on the whole, this was not drastically decreasing the stocks of Cast Down. This set was when people started talking again, that I heard, about, is Cast Down dead? And we quickly determined that was not going to be the case. However, it only took 6 months for us to get another set with not 10 but 11 legendary creatures at common, and this one once again with 3 that I think are potentially playable. The set has just released this past week, so we'll see if these actually all continue to be played, but the ones that I could see showing up even a month or 2 after the set has released is Raphael Tough Turtle. I'm not exactly sure the perfect shell for this. I have tried playing it in Red Rally and it didn't feel amazing. I could certainly see it in some Impact Tremors deck, like a Gruul Tokens, but it's very well costed for its stat line and ability, so I could definitely see it finding a home somewhere. Oroku Saki features a very juicy line of text, whenever, ... followed by you draw a card. This is kind of a color-shifted Ninja of the Deep Hours. One of Ninja of the Deep Hours' best features is that it's blue, so you can use a fairy to turn into the ninja without making your curve too difficult, going from one color to another. But Oroku has been showing up a little bit in Orzhov Glintblade decks, and could definitely be a real contender there. But the big bad of this new set is definitely Leonardo Big Brother. On the first day this card released, I played it in 2 leagues in White Weenie, and I went 10-0 in those leagues, getting 2 trophies. Leonardo was definitely a big help of that. He's also shown up in multiple top 8s for challenges already, including taking second place in one of those challenges. Not only that, but just reading the card, it's a heck of a lot scarier than a 3-3 that doesn't enter the battlefield tapped and attacking. Leonardo can instantly turn a 1-1 flying bird into a 7+ power creature without too much difficulty. So there definitely might be reasons to shift a little bit away from cast down, but is the card fully dead? Is there something better that we should be playing now? Well, we should look at the other options that we have. After cast down was downshifted, we got another downshift, which was Go for the Throat. This was downshifted in Warhammer 40k commander decks, and seeing as cast down was primarily better than it hasn't shown up too excessively in Pauper, but has recently started showing up in sideboards or even main decks for Food Pestilence decks that want 5th or 6th copies of cast down. So could Go for the Throat just take over cast down's responsibilities entirely? Well, we need to look at what actually dodges Go for the Throat in the format. Of course, we're a format where affinity is pretty prevalent, so there are some artifact creatures to watch out for. Mirror Enforcer is a very big one. If your premium removal spell is not hitting Mirror Enforcer, which is played in multiple meta decks, Grixis Affinity, Esper Affinity, as well as offshoots of those, Azorius, Dimir, etc., then you might be in some trouble. Of course, Reverse Familiar is featured in most of those decks as well, so suddenly your removal spell is not hitting half of the creatures, if not more, in their deck. Pactol Terror is a card that doesn't show up all the time, but when it does, you definitely want to have a removal spell for it. Clockwork Percussionist is a very prevalent creature, but not generally one you want to be casting down. But if you find yourself against 2 or 3 of them and you have these dead removal spells, it'll be even worse if you can't target them at all. Molten Gatekeeper is a pretty scary creature. Ginger Brute in the right Red Axis deck can be a creature you really need to kill, as you won't be able to block it and it could be hitting for as much as 3. If you happen to go up against Infect, Ichor Clawmere is something to kill. If you're against walls, Secret Door is an outlet that you might be needing to kill, assuming they have a ton of other ways to make mana. Crashing Drawbridge in walls and elves can be pretty key occasionally. Ethereum Spinner in the right brew can be a good creature to kill. Pinnacle Killship in Monster Tron. Pilipala in that combo deck. More Monster Tron, we have both Boulder Branch Golem and Maelstrom Colossus. So if you go up against Monster Tron, not the most prevalent deck, but if you go up against it, your removal spell is going to be almost entirely dead. And if you find yourself against a Hot Dogs opponent, Immolating Soul Eater is going to get you. Mukotai Ambusher, Scrapwork Mutt, Shield Wall Sentinel, just a few more artifact creatures. I will admit, not all of these are the number 1 creature you see. It's not a Tellurian Terror or a Sneaky Snacker, but they're pretty close, with Refurb and Mirror Enforcer being pretty prevalent. So for my money, Go for the Throat is definitely not going to be able to take the place of Cast Down. So let's go back in time. What about Doomblade? The format has changed a lot since August 2020, so for all we know, Black isn't played enough for Doomblade to be that bad, actually. Now, you're not going to want to play Doomblade if your opponent is playing any of these creatures at all. Sneaky Snacker, Refurb, Pactol Terror, Troll of Khazad-dûm, Kitchen Imp, Mesmeric Fiend, Thorn of the Black Rose, Balustrade Spy, Gixine Infiltrator. Personally, I would love for you to play Doomblade because my Carrion Feeders, Mortician Beetles, and Bloodthorn Vampires will survive it. We have a couple ninjas and a Gurmag Angler as well. Not to mention, any random brew could just have black creatures. These are just the most prevalent ones in the format. Doomblade is definitely out. But what about in mono-black decks like Gardens or mono-black Control? Maybe we're not playing that many vampires or werewolves or zombies in the format anymore. Well, I'll tell you right now, there are no werewolves that really see any play in the format. However, there are a few vampires and zombies. Refurb, Gurmag Angler. Again, I would love for you to play this because Carrion Feeder and Bloodthorn Vampire dodge it, as well as some of the fodder in Black Sack. Lotleth Giant if you need to kill that, Voldaren Epicure, Balustrade Spy, and even the Embalmed Sacred Cat is a zombie, which will definitely come up if you go up against a Coggate's opponent. So in addition to the fact that Victim of Night is only good in mono black decks, you're still missing out on a lot of really important creatures. So, is Cast Down dead? Well, compared to everything that we just saw that these other cards don't touch, I think the fact that Cast Down can't hit Spider-Man, Leonardo, potentially Oroku, Saki, and Raphael if they continue to see play, and the random mascot that your opponent has in their sideboard of Ramirez de Pietro, which occasionally happens on MTGO. I think Cast Down is still definitely going to be the best removal spell that you can play, even if it unfortunately is no longer universally removing what you need it to. At this current time, I would say Cast Down is still your best bet to be playing, although obviously if you are playing a deck like Jund that maybe is having trouble playing against White Weenie now with Leonardo as a way to deal a whole bunch of damage out of nowhere, you might want to shift your list specifically. Jund has quite a few options if you're playing against and worried about Leonardo. Snuff Out is a great one that is just absolutely free and can catch them entirely off guard if you're tapped out. You could split Cast Downs and Galvanic Blasts, which can be more reach for your deck and also just kill a Leonardo at a moment's notice. Or you could even put in a Terminate or two, seeing as you're playing red, which will not only catch Leonardo, but also a Guardian of the Guild Pact if your opponent is playing that. That said, Jund also just plays Croak Clan Shaman, which can already be a great boon against White Weenie and can definitely kill a Leonardo at a moment's notice. I do want to mention that while I think Cast Down is still your best bet right now, of course there is the possibility that with more Universes Beyond sets we will be getting more legendary creatures that could deteriorate Cast Down's effectiveness. This is definitely a possibility. However, there was recently an article by Eric Engelhard citing some of the restrictions that they have had to deal with around printing legendary creatures, how the rules they've made have kind of forced themselves to be printing these legendary commons based on the fact that these characters have names and are distinct creatures. But he also mentions that this is something that both he and Mark Rosewater are in favor of changing, making it so that you can print a Leonardo card at common that does not have to actually be legendary. Now, often when WotC employees are talking about something that they're thinking about right now, that means it's not going to take effect for easily a year or two. So if I had to bet, I would assume that the forthcoming Marvel, Hobbit, and Star Trek sets will probably feature some legendary commons, but it's possible in the coming years this will slow down. And if we slow down before we reach a critical mass of playable legendary creatures in Pauper, then it's possible Cast Down will continue being the go-to removal spell. Is Cast Down dead? I would definitely say no, but we are returning to an era where we don't have a 2-mana removal spell that just blanket kills anything in the format. Pauper was alive and thriving for a long time before Cast Down was around, when we had to use Doomblade, Victim of Night, and other removal spells that didn't always hit what we wanted it to, and Pauper will continue thriving even when Cast Down becomes a little bit less effective. Let me know your thoughts about Cast Down's new status in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you all next time.